A Syrian general's family boards a luxury private jet, thinking they're heading to a European vacation. The pilot seems professional. The flight attendants are polite. Everything looks completely normal. But halfway through the flight, something changes. The plane doesn't land where it's supposed to. When the doors finally open, they're not in Europe, they're in Israel. And standing there waiting for them are Mossad agents who have been planning this moment for months. This isn't a movie, this actually happened. And the story behind it is one of the most creative, most audacious kidnapping operations in intelligence history. It involved fake companies, fake identities, fake everything, and it worked perfectly. This is how Mossad used a private jet to kidnap a Syrian general's family and turn him into one of their most valuable assets. Before I get into the details of this operation, you need to understand the context, because this didn't happen randomly. There was a very specific reason why Mossad went through all this trouble, and that reason has to do with one of the most sensitive issues in Israeli security: the Israeli soldiers who went missing in Lebanon. For decades, Israel has had a policy of doing whatever it takes to bring back its soldiers, whether alive or dead. This goes back to the founding of the country. The idea is simple but powerful. If you serve Israel, Israel will never abandon you. No matter how long it takes, no matter what it costs, they will find you and bring you home. This policy has led to some incredible operations over the years. Prisoner exchanges, where Israel traded hundreds or even thousands of prisoners for a single soldier. Commando raids deep into enemy territory. Intelligence operations that lasted for years. The commitment is real, and Israel's enemies know it. Now, in the 1980s and 1990s, Israel had a major problem. Several of its soldiers had gone missing in Lebanon. Some had been captured during the long and bloody conflict there. Others had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Their families didn't know if they were alive or dead, and the Israeli government was under enormous pressure to find answers. The problem was that getting information about these soldiers was almost impossible. They were being held by various groups in Lebanon, most notably Hezbollah, and Hezbollah wasn't talking. They saw these prisoners as valuable bargaining chips and weren't going to give anything away for free. Israel tried everything. They negotiated through intermediaries. They offered deals. They applied pressure through various channels, but they kept hitting walls. The information they needed just wasn't available through normal means. That's when Mossad started looking for alternative approaches. If they couldn't get the information through negotiation, they would have to find another way. They needed sources. They needed people inside the Syrian and Lebanese power structures who could tell them what they wanted to know, and they were willing to go to extreme lengths to get those sources. This brings us to the man at the center of our story. I'm not going to use his real name because even today, some details of this operation remain classified. But let's call him General Mahmoud. He was a high-ranking officer in the Syrian military with connections to Lebanon and knowledge of what was happening there. Syria at this time was the dominant power in Lebanon. They had troops there. They had intelligence networks there. They controlled many of the levers of power. If anyone knew what was happening to the Israeli prisoners, it was people like General Mahmoud. But here's the thing about Syrian generals. They don't just walk into Israeli embassies and offer to become spies. They have families in Syria. They have careers. They have everything to lose. The penalties for treason in Syria are severe. We're talking torture, execution, the whole family suffering. No one in their right mind would take that risk voluntarily. So Mossad had to find a way to convince General Mahmoud to cooperate. And they decided that the best way to do that was to give him no choice. The plan they came up with was brilliant in its simplicity and audacious in its execution. They would kidnap the general's family, not to hurt them, but to hold them as leverage. Once Mossad had his family, the general would have to cooperate. He would have to provide information, because if he didn't, he would never see his loved ones again. Now, kidnapping the family of a Syrian general is not easy. They lived in Syria, a country that was essentially a police state under the Assad regime. Security was tight. Surveillance was everywhere. Getting them out of Syria would be virtually impossible. But Mossad noticed something. The general's family liked to travel. They enjoyed the good life that his position afforded them. And sometimes they traveled outside of Syria to places where the security was less intense. This was the opportunity Mossad had been waiting for. If they could catch the family during one of their trips abroad, they might be able to grab them without starting an international incident in Syria itself. The intelligence gathering phase of this operation took months. Mossad agents tracked the family's movements. They studied their travel patterns. They identified which family members traveled together and which stayed behind. They learned about their preferences, their habits, their routines. What they discovered was interesting. The general's wife and children occasionally traveled to Europe. They had done it before and would probably do it again. They usually went through intermediaries to book their travel, trying to maintain a low profile despite their privileged position. Mossad saw an opportunity. What if they could control the travel arrangements? What if instead of the family booking their own trip, Mossad could offer them a trip that seemed too good to refuse? A trip that would take them exactly where Mossad wanted them to go. This is where the fake private jet charter comes in. And this is where the operation gets really creative. Mossad set up a front company. From the outside, it looked like a legitimate business offering luxury travel services to wealthy clients in the Middle East. They created a whole identity for this company, a website, business cards, phone numbers that were answered by people who sounded completely professional. Everything about it seemed real because in a way it was real. It was a functioning business. It just happened to be run by Israeli intelligence. The company started making connections in the circles where wealthy Syrians moved. They got introductions. They built relationships. They established a reputation for providing excellent service and discretion. For months, they operated as a legitimate business, building trust and waiting for the right moment. Then, they made their move. Through intermediaries, they approached the general's family with an offer, a luxury private jet trip to Europe, first-class service, complete discretion, all the amenities that someone of their status would expect, and the price was attractive too. Not so cheap as to raise suspicion, but reasonable enough to be appealing. The family was interested. They had used similar services before. This company came recommended through channels they trusted. Everything checked out, so they agreed to the trip. What they didn't know was that every step of this process had been carefully orchestrated by Mossad. The intermediaries who made the introduction were either Mossad agents or people being manipulated by Mossad agents. The company they were dealing with existed only to execute this operation, and the luxury private jet waiting for them was essentially a flying trap. On the day of the trip, everything seemed normal. The family arrived at the airport. They were greeted by professional staff who treated them with the respect they expected. The jet was beautiful. It had all the luxury features promised. The pilot was experienced and confident. The flight attendants were courteous and attentive. The family settled in for what they thought would be a pleasant flight to Europe. They had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. The plane took off smoothly. The service was excellent. Everything was going according to plan, but it was Mossad's plan, not theirs. At some point during the flight, things changed. The exact details of what happened on that plane have never been fully disclosed, but we know the outcome. The plane did not land in Europe. It landed in Israel. When the doors opened, the family found themselves in a country that their own government considered an enemy. They were immediately taken into custody by Mossad. Now you might be wondering how the family reacted. Put yourself in their shoes for a moment. You think you're going on a nice vacation. You're enjoying a luxury flight, and then suddenly you realize you've been kidnapped by the intelligence service of a hostile nation. The fear and confusion must have been overwhelming. Mossad, to their credit, apparently treated the family well. They weren't tortured or abused. They were held in comfortable conditions. The goal was never to hurt them. The goal was to use them as leverage against the general, and that's exactly what happened next. Mossad made contact with General Mahmoud. They informed him that his family was in Israeli custody. They made it clear that his wife and children were safe for now, but their future depended entirely on his cooperation. The message was simple. If you want to see your family again, you need to work with us. You need to provide us with information. Specifically, you need to tell us everything you know about the Israeli soldiers missing in Lebanon. General Mahmoud was in an impossible position. He could refuse to cooperate, but then what? His family would remain in Israeli hands indefinitely. They might be well treated, but they would effectively be prisoners. He would never see them again. His children would grow up without their father, or he could cooperate. He could give Mossad what they wanted. In exchange, his family would be returned to him. He could resume his life, albeit with a terrible secret that he would have to carry forever. It wasn't really much of a choice. When someone has your family, you do what they say. That's just human nature, and Mossad was counting on exactly that. General Mahmoud agreed to cooperate. Over the following weeks and months, he provided Israeli intelligence with valuable information, details about the missing soldiers, information about Hezbollah's operations in Lebanon, intelligence about Syrian military activities, things that Israel desperately wanted to know. In exchange, Mossad kept their promise. The general's family was eventually returned safely. They were released in a way that minimized dismissed suspicion. The cover story held, and General Mahmoud went back to his life in Syria, now carrying the burden of what he had done. Let me step back for a moment and talk about why this operation was so significant, because it wasn't just about one kidnapping or one source. It represented something larger about how Mossad operates. First, it showed Mossad's willingness to think creatively. They didn't just try to approach the general directly or recruit him through traditional means. They came up with an entirely new approach, one that involved creating a fake business, maintaining cover for months, and executing a complex operation across multiple countries. This level of creativity is what sets elite intelligence agencies apart. Second, it showed Mossad's patience. This wasn't a quick operation. From the initial concept to the final execution, it probably took well over a year. The front company had to be established and built up. The target had to be identified and studied. The opportunity had to be created and then seized. Most people would have given up long before. Mossad didn't. Third, it showed Mossad's ruthlessness. Let's be clear about what happened here. They kidnapped innocent civilians, including children, to use as leverage against their father. The family had done nothing wrong. They were pawns in a larger game. Some people would call this morally questionable at best. Others would say it was necessary given the circumstances. But either way, it shows that Mossad is willing to do things that other organizations wouldn't consider. Fourth, it demonstrated the importance of the missing soldiers issue to Israel. The resources dedicated to this operation were enormous. The risks were significant. If something had gone wrong, it could have caused a major international incident, but Israel was willing to take those risks because bringing back its soldiers, or at least finding out what happened to them, was that important. Now let me talk about some of the technical aspects of this operation because they're fascinating from an intelligence perspective. Creating a convincing front company is harder than it sounds. It's not enough to just register a business name and print some cards. You need to create an entire ecosystem that can withstand scrutiny. That means real offices in real locations, phone lines that are answered professionally, a web presence that looks legitimate, employees who can interact with potential clients without raising suspicion. Mossad reportedly had experience with this kind of thing. They had created front companies before for various operations. They had people who specialized in building and maintaining these covers, but each operation presents unique challenges, and this one was no exception. The aviation aspect was particularly complex. Getting access to a private jet and crew that could be used for this operation wasn't simple. They needed a plane that looked legitimate and could pass inspection. They needed pilots who were either Mossad operatives or could be trusted to follow instructions without asking questions. They needed flight attendants who could maintain the illusion throughout the flight. The routing was also tricky. The plane had to take off from a location that made sense for the cover story. It had to fly a route that seemed normal until the moment it diverted, and then it had to land in Israel without the passengers realizing what was happening until it was too late. Some reports suggest that the plane's windows were treated in a way that made it difficult to see clearly outside. Others suggest that the passengers were sedated during the flight, though this is harder to confirm. What we know for sure is that when the plane landed, the family was caught completely off guard. The handling of the family after their arrival in Israel was also carefully planned. Mossad knew that how they treated these hostages would affect how the general responded. If the family was hurt or badly treated, he might refuse to cooperate out of anger and despair. But if they were treated well, he might be more willing to work with his captors, knowing that cooperation would lead to their release. This is a delicate balance. You want the target to be scared enough to cooperate, but not so traumatized that they become unmanageable. Mossad apparently struck this balance successfully. The communication with General Mahmoud was another critical phase. They had to contact him without alerting Syrian intelligence. They had to convince him that they really had his family and that they were serious about their demands. And they had to give him a way to respond and cooperate without being detected. How exactly they did this isn't public knowledge, but we know that Mossad has various means of secure communication that they use for situations like this. They might have arranged a meeting in a neutral country. They might have used intermediaries. They might have used encrypted communications. Whatever method they used, it worked. Now let's talk about what happened to the information that General Mahmoud provided, because this is really the point of the whole operation. The intelligence he gave Mossad reportedly included significant details about the Israeli soldiers who had gone missing in Lebanon. Some of this information was verification of things Israel suspected but couldn't confirm. Other details were entirely new. Unfortunately, much of what he revealed was tragic. Several of the missing soldiers were confirmed to be dead. Their remains had been disposed of in ways that made recovery difficult or impossible. For the families who had been waiting for years, hoping their loved ones might still be alive, this was devastating news. But at least it was closure. Some information pointed to prisoners who might still be alive. This led to further operations and negotiations. The intelligence was a piece of a larger puzzle that Israel was trying to solve over many years. General Mahmoud also provided information about Syrian military operations, Hezbollah's structure and capabilities, and other matters of interest to Israeli intelligence. This secondary information was valuable in its own right, helping Israel understand its enemies better. The question of whether the operation was worth it is complicated. From Israel's perspective, getting closure on missing soldiers was extremely important, both for the families and for national morale. Every piece of intelligence helped, and turning a Syrian general into a source, even temporarily, was a significant achievement. But there were costs too. The moral cost of kidnapping innocent family members, the risk of the operation being exposed and causing diplomatic problems, the possibility that General Mahmoud might be discovered and executed, which would make future recruitment of similar sources more difficult. These trade-offs are always part of intelligence work. Let me also discuss what this operation tells us about the relationship between Syria and Israel at the time, because this wasn't happening in a vacuum. Syria and Israel have been enemies since Israel's founding in 1948. They've fought multiple wars. They've engaged in countless smaller conflicts. The Golan Heights, a strategic area that Israel captured in 1967, remains a source of tension to this day. In the 1980s and 1990s, when this operation took place, Syria was heavily involved in Lebanon. They had deployed tens of thousands of troops there. They were supporting various militant groups, including Hezbollah, and they were actively working against Israeli interests in the region. For Israel, Syria was a major threat, not just because of its military, but because of its support for groups that attacked Israel. Getting intelligence on Syrian operations was a priority, and if that intelligence happened to also reveal information about missing soldiers, even better. The fact that Mossad was able to pull off this operation shows how far they were willing to go to gather intelligence on Syria. They weren't content to just watch from a distance or rely on electronic surveillance. They wanted human sources who could provide information that couldn't be gathered any other way. Syria, for its part, was paranoid about exactly this kind of infiltration. The Assad regime maintained extensive internal security services whose job was to catch spies and traitors. Anyone suspected of working with Israel faced severe consequences. This made recruiting Syrian sources incredibly dangerous and difficult. That's why the kidnapping approach was so clever. Instead of trying to convince someone to voluntarily betray their country, Mossad gave the general no choice. He didn't become a spy because he believed in Israel's cause or because he was greedy for money. He became a spy because his family's lives depended on it. That's a much more reliable form of leverage than ideological conversion or financial incentives. Now you might be wondering what eventually happened to General Mahmoud. The honest answer is that the full story isn't public. What we know comes from various sources, some more reliable than others. But let me share what's been reported. After his family was returned, the general apparently continued his career in the Syrian military. He had to act as if nothing had happened. If he suddenly resigned or behaved differently, Syrian intelligence might get suspicious. So he went back to work, carrying his secret. It's unclear whether Mossad maintained contact with him after the initial debriefing or whether it was a one-time extraction of information. Some sources suggest there was ongoing contact, with the general providing additional intelligence over time. Others suggest the relationship ended once his family was safely returned. The risk for the general was enormous. Syria's security services were always watching for signs of disloyalty. A senior officer with connections to Lebanon would be under particular scrutiny. One wrong move, one suspicious communication, and he would be arrested. We don't know if General Mahmoud was ever caught. If he was, it would have meant torture and almost certain death. His family, who had already been through one ordeal, would have suffered again. This is the dark side of intelligence work. The sources who take risks to provide information often face terrible consequences if they're discovered. Some researchers have suggested that Mossad helped relocate the general and his family after a certain point, getting them out of Syria to a safe country where they could live without fear. This would make sense from Mossad's perspective. Protecting your sources, even after their usefulness has ended, is important for maintaining the reputation that you keep your promises. Future sources need to know that if they work with you, you'll take care of them. But whether this actually happened, I can't say for certain. The details of what happened to General Mahmoud after the operation remain murky. Let me now talk about some of the broader lessons from this operation, because it's not just an interesting story. It tells us important things about how intelligence work is done. Lesson 1 is that leverage is everything. Mossad couldn't convince General Mahmoud to spy for them through normal means. He had no reason to help Israel and every reason not to, but by taking his family, they created leverage that he couldn't resist. This is a common theme in intelligence work, finding the pressure point, the thing that someone cares about more than anything else, and then using it. Lesson 2 is that patience pays off. This operation took months or even years to plan and execute. The front company had to be built up. The opportunity had to be identified. Everything had to be perfect before they moved. In an age of instant gratification, this kind of long-term thinking is rare, but it's essential for complex operations. Lesson 3 is that creativity matters. There's no playbook for an operation like this. Someone at Mossad had to imagine it, to see the possibility where others saw only obstacles, and then they had to convince their superiors to approve it, to allocate resources, to take the risk. This kind of creative thinking is what separates good intelligence agencies from great ones. Lesson 4 is that execution is as important as planning. A good plan badly executed will fail. The people who ran this operation had to get every detail right. The front company had to be convincing. The jet had to be realistic. The extraction had to be smooth. Any mistake could have blown the whole thing. And lesson 5 is that there are always moral trade-offs. Mossad achieved their objective, but they did it by kidnapping innocent people. The general's wife and children hadn't done anything wrong. They were victims of circumstances beyond their control. Is it okay to do this to innocent people in pursuit of important goals? Different people will answer that question differently, but it's a question that intelligence agencies face constantly. Now let me share some context about how this operation fits into Mossad's broader history, because this wasn't the only time they've done something like this. Mossad has a long track record of creative operations. From the capture of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina in 1960 to the assassination of Hamas leaders around the world, they've shown a willingness to go anywhere and do whatever it takes to achieve their objectives. The use of front companies is a particularly common tactic. Mossad has created fake businesses in various industries to provide cover for operations. These range from simple storefronts to elaborate international enterprises that operate for years. The level of effort they put into these covers is remarkable. The focus on missing soldiers is also consistent with Israeli policy. Over the years, Israel has conducted numerous operations aimed at recovering soldiers or their remains. They've negotiated prisoner exchanges that seemed wildly unbalanced to outsiders, trading hundreds of prisoners for a single soldier. This commitment is deeply embedded in Israeli society and shapes how its intelligence services operate. The willingness to kidnap or assassinate enemies abroad is another constant theme. Mossad doesn't recognize borders when it comes to what they see as threats to Israel. They've operated in dozens of countries, sometimes with the knowledge of local authorities and sometimes without. This global reach is one of their most important capabilities. What makes the private jet operation interesting is how it combines several of these elements in a new way. Front company operations usually support intelligence gathering or assassinations. This one supported a kidnapping. The patient approach usually applies to long-term source recruitment. Here it was applied to a coercive operation. The creativity wasn't in any single element, but in how everything was put together. I also want to talk about the aviation angle because it's particularly fascinating. Using aircraft in intelligence operations has a long history. Planes have been used to infiltrate agents into enemy territory, to extract sources who need to escape, to conduct surveillance, and occasionally for more dramatic purposes. But using a private jet as essentially a mobile trap was relatively novel. The victims got on the plane voluntarily. They didn't need to be subdued until they were already in the air. And once you're in a plane, you can't exactly jump out and escape. You're committed until it lands. This approach has certain advantages over other methods. A ground-based kidnapping might be interrupted by police or witnesses. There's always the risk of a chase. or a confrontation. But once the targets are on a plane, those risks largely disappear. The kidnappers have complete control of the environment. Of course, there are challenges too. Aircraft are highly regulated. Flight plans have to be filed. Landings require coordination with airports. There are lots of records that could potentially be traced. Mossad had to navigate all of this while maintaining their cover. The fact that they pulled it off shows how sophisticated their planning was. Let me also address some of the criticism that operations like this attract. Not everyone thinks what Mossad did was justified. In fact, many people around the world would consider it a serious crime. From a legal perspective, what happened was clearly illegal under international law. Kidnapping is a crime. Taking people across borders against their will is a crime. Using false pretenses to lure victims is fraud, and more. If anyone involved in this operation were caught and prosecuted, they could face serious charges. From an ethical perspective, the questions are even harder. Is it okay to kidnap innocent family members to pressure their relative? Most people would say no, that's wrong. You don't punish the innocent for what their relatives might know. You don't use children as bargaining chips. But defenders of operations like this would argue that the context matters. Israel was trying to find out what happened to its missing soldiers. These were young men who had served their country and whose families deserved answers. If kidnapping a general's family was the only way to get that information, was it not justified? This is the kind of debate that has no easy answer. Different ethical frameworks lead to different conclusions. Utilitarians might support the operation if the overall outcome was positive. Deontologists would likely oppose it because the methods were inherently wrong, regardless of the outcome. Virtue ethicists might ask what kind of character is reflected in people who plan and execute such operations. I'm not going to tell you what to think about this. You'll have to make your own judgment. But it's worth thinking about these questions because they apply to intelligence work more broadly. What are we willing to accept in the name of security? Where are the lines that shouldn't be crossed? How do we balance competing values like safety and morality? Intelligence agencies face these questions constantly, and the answers they come up with shape the world we live in. Let me also discuss the Syrian perspective on operations like this, because what looks like a brilliant intelligence coup from one side looks very different from the other. For Syria, having one of its generals compromised by Israeli intelligence was a disaster. The information he provided would have helped Israel in ways that damaged Syrian interests. The fact that Israel could reach into Syria's upper ranks and extract secrets was a sign of vulnerability. Syria's response to such penetrations was typically harsh. Anyone suspected of spying for Israel could expect torture and death. The security services would launch investigations looking for others who might be compromised. Paranoia would increase, which sometimes led to innocent people being accused and punished. The families of suspected traitors would also suffer. In authoritarian regimes like Assad's Syria, the concept of collective punishment is common. If you were related to someone who betrayed the state, you might lose your job, your home, your freedom. The sins of one family member were visited on all. General Mahmoud, if he was ever discovered, would have faced all of this. His family, who had already been traumatized by the kidnapping, would have suffered again. From a Syrian perspective, he would be remembered not as a victim of Israeli coercion, but as a traitor who deserved whatever punishment he received. This is the terrible position that Mossad put him in. They made him choose between his immediate family and his country. They made him a traitor, not through ideological conversion, but through threat and fear. And then they left him to live with the consequences. Some would argue that Mossad bears responsibility for whatever happened to the general after the operation. By coercing him into spying, they put his life at risk. If he was caught and executed, his blood would be on their hands as much as on Syria's. Others would argue that the general made his own choice. He could have refused to cooperate, even knowing the consequences for his family. He could have reported the approach to Syrian intelligence. He chose to betray his country, and he has to own that choice. Again, I'm not going to resolve this debate for you, but it's important to understand that these operations have human costs that extend far beyond the immediate participants. The ripples spread outward, affecting families and communities and relationships in ways that are hard to predict or measure. Now let me talk about what we can learn from this operation that might apply more broadly. Because while most of us will never be involved in intelligence work, there are lessons here that are relevant to other areas of life. First, the power of patience. In our fast-paced world, we often want results immediately. But some goals require sustained effort over long periods. Building something valuable, whether it's a business or a relationship or a body of knowledge, takes time. The willingness to work toward a goal for months or years, maintaining focus even when progress seems slow, is a valuable skill. Second, the importance of attention to detail. This operation required getting countless small things right. The front company had to be convincing. The communications had to be secure. The logistics had to be perfect. Any weak link could have broken the chain. In whatever you do, the details matter. Taking the time to get them right can make the difference between success and failure. Third, the value of seeing things from different angles. The people who planned this operation had to think like their targets. What would make the general's family accept the offer? What would make them trust the front company? What would make them get on that plane? This kind of perspective taking is valuable in any endeavor that involves other people. Fourth, the reality of hard choices. Most interesting problems involve trade-offs. You can't have everything. You have to decide what you're willing to sacrifice to achieve your goals. Understanding this and being honest about the trade-offs you're making is important for making good decisions. And fifth, the existence of unintended consequences. Even successful operations can have results that weren't anticipated. The ripple effects of actions spread in unpredictable ways. This is a reason for humility. We should be careful about assuming we know all the effects of what we do. Before I wrap up, let me share a few more thoughts about this operation's place in history. Because while it's not as famous as some other Mossad operations, it's significant in several ways. It represents a certain era of intelligence work, when creativity and audacity could accomplish things that today might be more difficult. With increased security everywhere, better surveillance technology, and more international cooperation against terrorism, pulling off an operation like this has become harder. The front company approach still works, but there are more ways to check and verify information. The aviation industry is more regulated. The margins for error are smaller. It also represents a particular approach to the problem of intelligence gathering. Instead of trying to convince someone to spy through traditional recruitment, Mossad took a shortcut. They created leverage that couldn't be resisted. This approach has been used by other agencies in other contexts. It's effective, but raises serious ethical questions. And it represents the ongoing struggle between Israel and its neighbors, a conflict that has shaped the Middle East for decades and continues to do so today. The missing soldiers who were the initial motivation for this operation are part of a larger story of war and loss that affects millions of people. Every operation, every source, every piece of intelligence is connected to that bigger picture. The story of how Mossad used a fake private jet charter to kidnap a Syrian general's family is, in some ways, a small story. It's about a few people, a single operation, a limited objective, but in other ways, it's a window into how the secret world works, the patience and creativity required, the moral compromises involved, the human costs on all sides. When I think about this operation, I'm struck by its elegance. From a purely technical standpoint, it was beautifully designed and executed. Every piece fit together. The plan worked exactly as intended. That's not easy to achieve in the messy real world, but I'm also struck by its darkness. Real people were traumatized. A man was forced to betray his country. Families were torn apart. All of this in the service of goals that, while important to Israel, don't justify anything in the eyes of those who suffered. This is the nature of intelligence work. It exists in a gray zone where normal rules don't apply. The people who do it believe they're serving a higher purpose. Their enemies see them as criminals and terrorists. The truth, as always, is complicated. What we can say for certain is that this operation happened. It achieved its objectives, and it left behind a legacy that still echoes today. In the quiet competition between intelligence services, in the ongoing conflict between Israel and its neighbors, in the lives of everyone affected, the ripples continue to spread. The private jet that carried a Syrian general's family to Israel is long gone. The front company that Mossad created has been dissolved. The people involved have moved on to other operations or retired from the field. But the story remains, a reminder of what determined people with sufficient resources can accomplish when they set their minds to it. And somewhere, perhaps, The family that was kidnapped still remembers that day. The confusion and fear when they realized what was happening, the uncertainty of their captivity, the relief when they were finally released. For them, it wasn't a clever operation or an intelligent success. It was the worst experience of their lives. That's the thing about stories like this. They look different depending on where you're standing. From Tel Aviv, this was a triumph. From Damascus, it was an outrage. From the perspective of the missing soldiers' families, it was a source of painful closure. From the perspective of the kidnapped family, it was a trauma that will never fully heal. Intelligence work creates these multiple truths. It's a world where everyone believes they're right and everyone has reasons for what they do. The challenge for the rest of us is to understand these different perspectives without losing our own moral compass. Subscribe to see more stories like this one